Thanks, everyone. And most importantly, thanks to Eilis for coming. So there's a bit of a story here. So for some of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Deutsch, and one of the things we have here is a Sport for Climate and Action Nature research group, which is a number of funded PhDs, some of whom are in the room. And when I came here, partly how do we start to develop some research culture around sport and climate change? And one of the things was, how can we bring in some really talented and amazing postdoctoral students and look for fellows? And I cast my nets wide across Europe, and a name that came back from a couple of people was Eilis. And we worked together and developed a Marie Curie Fellowship proposal, which was very successful, hence why she's here. But part of it is about bringing in different ways of thinking about sport, because climate change is here, it's not going to go away. It's something that is impacting sport, but also something that potentially we can engage people through sport and engage them to do and take climate action. And in the way, it's also about how we do that. So partly it's about being interdisciplinary, it's about bringing in different disciplines who maybe aren't thinking about it already, but it's also about bringing in partners and working with people on the ground who are actually doing the hard work. And I think that's fundamentally what we should be doing as academics, is working with our communities, participatory approaches, and actually making stuff happen. So you're not here to listen to me. So I'm going to hand over to Eilis, and she can tell you more about her amazing project.
Oh, hi, thank you everybody for coming. So I'm Eilis Lanclus. I'm a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow here at Loughborough with the School for Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. And I want to tell you a bit more about my current research project and how I got to this project in my presentation titled Outdoor Recreation and Climate Change, Human-Environment Relations in Trail Sports. So I'll start by giving you a bit of background information on my PhD research, and then I'll go to an ethnographic vignette from this research and how that then led to the initial ideas that led me to come to Loughborough with my project. Okay. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, trail and off-road sports such as trail running, but also hiking, mountain biking, gravel biking, saw a surge in popularity as individuals are seeking out more green spaces, both for physical activity and mental well-being. So based on the trend report of Strava, we saw an increase of 55% in 2023 for gravel cycling and 16% for trail runners compared to 2022. And in 2024, walking clubs were on the rise with 52% growth, which continued into 2025. So I started my PhD research in 2019 on ultra trail runners and walkers in Belgium. And so I saw this growing popularity in trail sports and ultra trail sports up close. Let me start with addressing what ultra trail running and walking is. So ultra running or ultra marathon running in scholarly literature, but also as defined by the International Association of Ultra Runners, is any distance beyond the marathon, which is 42.195 kilometers. So trail running then is defined by the International Trail Running Association, or ITRA as they're better known, as a sport that takes place amid nature and with respect for the environment, a sense of humility, shared community, and a strong sense of sport ethics. Now, trail running does not always involve long distances, but ultra running and trail running often do go hand in hand. I think over 85% of ultra running events take place on trails. So briefly, ultra trail running then is running of distances beyond the marathon on trails. But ultra trail running is about more than just the distance, the terrain, or the time covered. Some runners say it's about the pushing of your limits, whether they be physical, mental, or emotional. So my research also included walking, so not just running, and also looked at how walking and running relate to each other on trails. So I use the term ultra trail walking here in my research, as I looked specifically on long distance walking on trails. So when covering long distances in challenging environments, the lines between running and walking tend to blur, and this is a common thread in ultra trail, is endurance done on foot. So what's endurance then? Generally, it's defined as the ability to keep going in the face of corporal and cognitive pain, discomfort, and suffering. But the meanings and values that are given to endurance are attributed by people at a certain time, in a certain place, and according to views of the world that are available to them. So endurance is not necessarily inherent to certain activities, but it needs to be understood in relation to the dominant discourses and imaginaries of a given society. So by studying the practices of ultra trail running and walking, I have attempted to unpack the meanings and values given to endurance in contemporary Western society. So my PhD research centered on the questions, what are the expressions of endurance experiences in ultra trail running and walking? And what can they tell us about the contemporary societal context in which these endurance activities take place? So I won't go too deep into the answers to this question or my research findings. I'll just highlight some aspects of the research that are important to the current research project for the postdoc. So in order to answer this research question, I employed different methods. So the data collection phase started in 2019 and lasted until the mid-2022. I conducted over 30 interviews, both walking interviews and more traditional sit-down interviews with different actors and different stakeholders. And I carried out a large-scale survey for boat runners and walkers in Flanders. But the main research method was ethnographic fieldwork. So for my ethnographic fieldwork, I immersed myself in the life worlds of ultra-trail runners and walkers in Belgium to the extent that it was possible. As you might have seen from the dates of my data collection phase, my research took place right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And yeah, 2019 was mostly an exploratory research phase. So yeah, my fieldwork was heavily influenced by the pandemic. So I attended various ultra trail events with different formats, and I also engaged in digital events and challenges during periods of lockdown and restrictions. And then I also joined people on runs and walks all over Belgium, which I also recorded with a GoPro. So this in-depth ethnographic fieldwork on endurance was carried out mainly on trails. Now, endurance was a central focus of the research, using ultra trail running and walking as an analytical lens. But the trails themselves served as sites where I examined these broader societal trends. I therefore call this an anthropology on trails, drawing inspiration from the work of Dimitris Dalakoglu. He wrote this book called The Road, where he presented his ethnographic and historic study of the main highway between Albania and Greece. And he wrote that more than an ethnography on the road, it's an anthropology on the road. So he uses this road and the politics and poetics of this road as an entry point for an anthropological analysis of South Albania. And so in arguing for his anthropology on the road, he writes that this highway, so in his ethnographic case, encapsulates social significance and is integrated in the entire ongoing sociocultural transformation, but that it also emerges as the ideal place where an anthropologist can perceive, study, and even touch the various dynamic and fluid sociocultural transformations. So, and I argue that the same goes for trails. So, what's a trail then? I asked myself and my participants this question a lot at the start of my fieldwork, so much so that they joked that I should title my dissertation, "Is this a trail?" So a trail is essentially a visible linear pathway of many varieties, which is evident on the ground and which may have at its roots an original and historical linear transport or travel function. Now, there are two elements in this definition that I want to address. So the first is this historical linear transport or travel function. So trails all over the world and in different contexts used to be a way to get to your destination as quickly as possible. However, at present, trails are predominantly for recreational purposes, and they're often intertwined with tourism. So whereas historically trails used to ease travel, which is the same logic behind those of like pavements and roads, right? Trails in a recreational context nowadays are not per se meant to ease travel, but rather to experience something else, which we'll get to later. So, secondly, these trails are always evident on the ground. So I would say they're not always evident on the ground, or at least not in my fieldwork experiences. So there are many reasons as to why a trail is not always evident or clearly visible. Amongst others, they become overgrown with brambles, they're taken off the mat, or they become private property. So all of these examples suggest the same, they're not in frequent use anymore. So starting from the idea that trails are neither fixed nor static, trails are made as they are used, or in this particular ethnographic case, as runners and walkers are practicing their leisure activities on these trails. So trails tend to form in reverse, messily from the passage of dirty feet, and are unplanned, unkept, and unruly. Now, paths, in comparison, are perceived as being more civilized in part of their resemblance to other urban architectural projects. They are lines projected forward in space by the intellect and constructed with those noble appendages, the hands. And they have a connotation of being more tame and more dignified. So trails change, they're remade, they come into existence from scratch through how they are used and who uses them. So I will return to these both aspects later. But now I want to give you a bit more of a tangible feel of my research by taking you on a walk with my two of my participants through an ethnographic vignette. So this vignette is of a fieldwork experience that was marked by an event that led me to the initial ideas of my current project that's on trail sports, climate change, and environmental engagements. So here goes. It's a Thursday early morning, or rather night, in July 2021, when Emile and Bernard come to pick me up at my house. I've been going on walks with Emile since the beginning of my fieldwork in January 2020, and with Bernard since the summer of 2020. Both are 40-year-old white middle-class men from Belgium, as most of my research participants are. Today we're driving to Maubeuge, which is in the Ardennes in Belgium. So the Ardennes is a hilly forested region in southern Belgium known for its quiet villages, winding rivers, and outdoor activities such as trail running and hiking, which is what we're going to do. So the three of us are participating in the same trail race in September and decided to do some recon together to prepare us for the actual race. Once we stocked up our backpacks, retied our shoelaces, and fixed our hiking poles, we take off for a 100-kilometer walk with about 3,000 meters of positive elevation, which, yes, you can do in Belgium. So after about 35 kilometers of winding forest trails above the valley, we descend into Houffalize, another town in the Ardennes, famous as a hub for outdoor activities. We stock up at the supermarket, refuel, and rest before heading back out on the trails. From here, the route follows the river Ourthe, downstream back to Maubeuge, our starting point. So we're making a loop. So leaving Houffalize, the trail quickly narrows as it slips towards the river Ourthe. The river keeps us company for a while, with its edge closer than normally, and slowly the trail begins to reveal its strangeness to us. So sections of the trail are eroded or abruptly interrupted by piles of tangled wood. This is not uncommon in the Ardennes. So my participants call this playing trail Mikado. I don't know if you have this game here, Mikado. It's like sort of like a Jenga, but with sticks. But yeah, whatever. But so the piles are bigger and more dense than usual, and we even need to use our hiking poles to make our way through the tangled wood. We encounter these piles more frequently as well. Entire trees lie across the trail, roots pointing skyward, their trunks stripped bare. There are heaps of branches washed into odd places and stones scattered where they don't belong. We continue to step over, duck under, and detour around these interruptions, which not only make the hike more exhausting and slower than anticipated, but they're also a reminder that the landscape has been reshaped more drastically than anticipated since we last passed through. Now, in some places, the trail simply disappears, swallowed by deposits of slit or by unusual high water levels. We stop, puzzled at first, then find a way around, climbing over the debris or detouring up the hillside and coming back down once the trail is visible again, creating new trails as we go. However, there's not always the option of detouring. So Emile and Bernard don't bother looking for a dry alternative route and just walk through the river. The GPS offers little guidance at this point as well. What is drawn on the map is no longer matches what is there. Although it rarely does, to be fair, along the routes that Emile makes, because this is part of the appeal of the sport for him, is not knowing exactly what is or is not a trail. Makes navigation more challenging, but also the kind of trails that we then end up on. But yeah, today, however, the difficulty in finding the trail is due to external circumstances and not Emile's route planning. So Emile and Bernard, however, are clearly not bothered at all by the transformed landscape. On the contrary. And knowing that we still have 50 kilometers ahead of us, I try to keep my feet as dry as possible. Emile and Bernard laugh while watching me from the river as I climb rocks and debris. You'll have to give up at some point. It's not going to get any better. And yeah, they were right. Forced by the severely altered landscape, I end up walking in the river as well. So not only did the trail disappear on the banks of the river, but also the bridges that we were meant to take to cross the river are gone. Some bridges were remarkably still standing, with only little damage done to them. Nevertheless, the longer we continue along the river, the more the valley starts to feel like a crime scene. Visually, the landscape is littered with clues of destruction. Climbing over the debris and piles of tangled wood requires strength that we no longer have. And even though a muddy walk is no stranger to us, it does add dragging weight to our legs. Parts of the route that should have been a smooth line along the river to give our legs some rest from the other parts of the technical terrain have become a jagged, improvised route, leaving no rest at all for either our bodies or our minds. Now, it's the middle of the night, and the three of us are walking in a single file, our head torches cutting through the darkness. Every now and then we come across a slick of clay that slides underfoot, and we rely on our hiking poles to keep us upright. The debris, fallen trees and branches, and hidden piles of slits all become hard to see. Each step requires careful probing with our poles, and climbing over the obstacles on the trail has become noticeably more taxing for all three of us. Emile and Bernard are no longer expressing joy over the challenging route, and they're no longer telling me to play. Once we reach Maubeuge, we rest at the car, which we packed with camping chairs, a cool box, and thermoses full of coffee, serving as an improvised ration station. We plop down in our camping chairs and enjoy our coffees. It does not take long, however, before Bernard falls asleep, sliding further down in his chair with each exhale. Full of courage to finish what we've started, Emile and I wake up Bernard, pack up the chairs, and we start the last loop out of Maubeuge to push us to our final goal of 100 kilometers. Bernard, however, cannot stay awake. It's fine, Emile says to me as I express my concerns for his safety. Once we get properly going again, he'll snap out of it. However, what Emile didn't account for was the current state of the trail. Even though we're moving away from the river, the rocky trail was still so waterlogged that it remained treacherously slippery. The fact that it's the middle of the night and we only have our head torches to light the way didn't help either. Bernard, who had been using his hiking poles to stay upright as he was dozing off, slipped and fell. Okay, Emile said, let's return to the car. The trail is too dangerous to walk like this. So while I tried to keep Bernard upright, which was easier said than done given his height, Emile looked for an asphalt road on his GPS to guide us back safely as possible to the car park. So in the end, we walked 80 kilometers instead of the aspired 100, but we did so through a landscape that was still a fresh and open wound from what had happened 2 weeks earlier. So Belgium and most of Western Europe was hit by what newspapers described as a deluge of biblical proportions. Between the 13th and 15th of July 2021, a so-called stubborn low-pressure system parked over the region unleashed an exceptionally heavy rainfall in the upland borders of Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. The river Ourthe, which is the one that we were hiking along, together with the rivers Amblève and Vesdre, had previously unobserved peak water levels and stream flow values. The consequences were devastating. More than 180 people died, over 800 people were severely injured, and many were left without a home to return to. Now, in Belgium, the event since has come to symbolize the new reality of extreme weather events, which, due to climate change, are expected to happen more frequently and more intensely as well. So when Emile, Bernard, and I set out for our hike, we made sure that we were not encountering the most damaged areas, but we did not expect that we would find the trails in the state that they were. So our encounters are, of course, nothing compared to the loss that many experienced during this flood and in the aftermath of it. But these encounters on the trails do stir an embodied unease in those moving along them, a recognition of landscapes as vulnerable, already altered, and continuously reshaped by the climate crisis. So I started asking myself, how can these sensory and affective lived experiences on trails invite a shift from trail sports as acts of personal conquest or consumption of landscapes to practices grounded in care, attention, and ecological responsibility? And so this inspired my new project, Trail Sense, in which I examine how the emplaced and situated experiences and knowledges of trail sport participants shape the environmental engagements in trail sports. So, what do I mean when I say emplaced and situated experiences and knowledges? Ultra trail running and walking, as well as other trail sports, involve a deep engagement with the environment due to their repeated interactions with various landscapes. Through these activities, runners and walkers navigate diverse terrains, which provide rich experiential data on how individuals perceive and engage with their surroundings. So I argue that ultra trail runners and walkers do not just move in a specific environment, but also with that environment. So what I mean by that is that ultra trail running and walking is not just a bodily activity that takes place in a specific environment, but that environment itself is an active agent in how it shapes their experiences. And I'm talking particularly about trails here. But yeah, so ultra trail running and walking is just not only an embodied endurance experience, it's also an emplaced endurance experience. And whereas emplacement is generally understood as a sort of mind-body environment framework, I argue that it needs to be understood as a dynamic, omnidirectional, and dialectical relationship that shapes, in this case, the ultra trail runners and walkers' ways of being in the world. So what I mean by that is that ultra trail running and walking is not only about what these activities do to the environment or how the environment informs their activities. It's about the reciprocal interaction between body, mind, environment, and I add to this equation movement that is mutually shaping their lived experiences whilst also creating a constant tension between these elements. So this relationship, this generates a sort of epistemological partnership that underpins how ultra trail runners and walkers learn, construct meaning, and experience endurance. Now, this relationship is not perceptually shared, so much like a sense of place is provoked by particular landscapes, an individual's experience and condition is shaped by their particular senses. So emplacement is not unidirectional and place is not universal, but it's a multifactorial dialectical relationship between body, mind, environment, and movement. So examining how trail sport participants relate differently to the same environments and examining the experiences and types of knowledges that inform these relationships creates a space to study the messy and multi-layered processes that shape human-environment relations, especially in times of anthropogenic climate change or climate crisis. So in doing so, I aim to understand the lived realities that shape trail sport practices, as well as the environmental engagements in these sports, whilst grounding this analysis in the experiences and knowledges of the people and organizations that are directly involved, rather than reproducing hegemonic discourses of endurance and nature in a totalizing way. So instead, I intend to how these discourses are articulated, embodied, and placed, and occasionally unsettled by the very participants who circulate within them. So I'll take a closer look now at some examples of these experiences on trails. And to do so, I first want to return to ITRA, the International Trail Running Association, because they also give us a definition for what a trail race is. So a trail race is a pedestrian competition open to everyone, which takes place in a natural environment with the minimum possible of paved roads. The course can range from a few kilometers for shorter distances all the way to 80 kilometers and beyond for ultra trail races. mountains or forest, countryside or desert, this endurance race takes place on naturally variable terrain, including very often significant climbs and descents, which result in elevation gain and loss between the start and finish line. So distance isn't the only thing that matters. Together, the unique features of the terrain and the relationship between distance and elevation changes all work together to create the overall level of difficulty for a given race. So that's their definition. So as we saw earlier in the vignette with Emile and Bernard, they're not alone in trying to avoid paved and asphalted roads as much as possible. It's inherent to trail running, to ultra trail running, to trail sports in general. So it's not just the distance of the trail that they choose that impacts the level of a runner's or walker's experience, but also the difficulties in terms of elevation and topography. So like Emile and Bernard, most of my research participants have reached some level of experience and expertise with trails. So not only do they opt for longer, more difficult trails when training or designing a route, but they try to avoid crowded trails as much as possible. Now, whether a trail is crowded or not depends on the season, there's marked routes in the vicinity, but also the trail condition. So they actively look for remote, off the beaten track trails with the least possible traces of human intervention. Now, other research has shown that signs of human activity on trails influences people's experiences in a negative manner. However, these kind of trails can often only be found in the most remote wilderness areas, and even then, trampled trails are signs of human existence and cultural values being placed upon the environment. Now, these trails are longed for by my participants, by ultra trail runners and walkers, but also by more and more by the general public as well. Exactly because they seem isolated or untouched, and as my participants say a lot, they evoke the feeling of being alone in the world. And with this perceived absence of humans and human intervention also comes this notion of silence, wildness. Now, it's been long established by other scholars like Philippe Descola and Roderick Nash that the concept of wildness or wilderness or wild nature is in the first place a concoction of the human mind, right? It's made by contrasting it to like urban areas or even like civilization. And it can also be argued that Belgium really doesn't have any truly isolated or wild places. But what's important here are the imaginaries of these places, as being untouched, unspoiled, and how these imaginaries play a role in runners and walkers' choices when they're pursuing their leisure activities. So when I say that ultra trail runners and walkers try to avoid crowds as much as possible, and they long for places that seem isolated, it's also significant to talk about who forms part of these crowds that they're trying to avoid and who they, the ultra trail runners and walkers, are. So to address the latter first, my research participants are all able-bodied from predominantly middle to upper middle class backgrounds, occupying professional positions that afford financial and temporal resources that are needed to sustain a long-term engagement in this sport. Now, while most participants are male, more women have found their way to the community and to ultra trail in general. But yeah, it remains a male-dominated environment for lots of different reasons, which we don't have time to get into now. But and the sport is growing internationally. Both ultra trail and trail running are being professionalized. And with this growth comes a certain degree of diversification. But yeah, it remains a predominant white space. So these are obviously elements that need to be considered when we're analyzing this dialectical relationship that is occurring. So whose bodies are we talking about here, and how does that shape the relationship with the trails and broader environments that they're moving in? And so secondly, going back to this issue of who the ultra trail runners and walkers are trying to avoid when they speak of crowds, they refer to other trail users in terms of means of movement. So like runners, walkers, mountain bikers, but also equestrians. But equally, they refer to the level of trail experience that these users have. And so, for example, what my research participants would call like day tourists, or, and this is very specific to the context that I did my research in, corona walkers, which is what they call people that, you know, before the pandemic were never seen on the trails, right? But yeah, so both of these groups, you know, are assumed to have a sort of lesser relationship with the trails and the environments, however you want to interpret that, I guess. But yeah, so there was like a clear disdain for corona walkers, because they were being blamed for creating corona trails that came into existence during the pandemic. So much like in the vignette when we try to detour and find our way around debris on the trail, yeah, that's exactly what a corona trail is. So basically, this trail here didn't exist, right? But because the trail remains super waterlogged and people generally don't want to walk through a puddle like that, they start walking around it. And that's what they would then refer to as a corona trail that was then created by people who, you know, don't belong necessarily on the trails. That's a whole other issue. Very loaded as well. Yeah, so what they would call these corona trails in scholarly literature is described as a desire path or a desire trail, meaning, and I quote here, an informal path or trail eroded in the landscape by human or animal traffic, end quote. So these desire trails demonstrate how people generally don't tend to follow the designs that are imposed upon them. And you know, you could say that these trail users fulfill a sort of collective desire that keeps these trails in existence. The author Robert Moore would say that, you know, once the desire fades, these trails will fade too. But yeah, so it could be argued that a lot of the trails that I did my fieldwork on were desire trails. The issue with this, of course, is specifically also with these corona trails as they were occurring during the pandemic, was that they were often created in protected natural environments and they tend to harm fauna. And during the pandemic, nature organizations in Belgium on several occasions placed a sort of national call in the newspaper to ask these corona walkers to remain on the official already existing trails and paths because you know, they were disturbing breeding seasons of different animals that were protected as well. So these desire trails can emerge out of an ignorance for the protected area or a desire to discover new places or, you know, to avoid mud or large puddles. But regardless of the intention, once a desire trail is created, it's difficult for people to not follow these trails that are left behind by their predecessors. You know, they're literally written in the dirt. And applications like Strava, but other trail applications as well, perpetuate these desire trails. You know, the trails show up on a runner or a walker's routes, and then they upload their activity. And then through like, you know, heat maps and stuff like that, people will discover these new trails, and a more organized movement will eventually establish this trail, even if they're not shown on official maps. People will use them. And so, you know, as this sign in my, which used to be my local forest, you know, this forest conservation organizations that try to reverse these desire trails, they call them sneak trails. You know, they place these signs at the start of these trails, trying to stop people from retracing the steps of their predecessors and ensuring its discontinuation to protect animals, their habitat, and, you know, the environment in general. So yeah, I'd like to return one last time to the definition of ITRA on trail running, because they added to their definition a particular or specific paragraph on the role of the environment in trail running. So they write, born of the pleasure of running amid nature, trail running is above all a communion with our environment. The runner, liberated from the trappings of our modern world, practices his or her sport amid a demanding environment for both mind and body. As a physical and mental challenge, trail running encourages each of us to explore our capabilities with an abiding sense of humility in contact with both wild and fragile spaces. While trail running, we pay attention to our senses without just focusing on performance. In these moments, we can also develop our physical and mental abilities. In the end, what ultimately drives us as runners, after all, is to simply cross the finish line. Now, as hopefully it's clear by now that the environment, and its specificities is very critical to the experience in nature-based sports, such as trail running and ultra trail running and walking. It's even, essential in determining the kind and degree of excellence that is achieved within these sports, which often ends up instrumentalizing the natural environments through which they move. Now, the trails and surrounding environments become a setting for their endurance challenges, and landscapes that are altered, by example, because of floods, as we've seen, make the trails more challenging and, test their endurance and their skill set even more. So these so-called wild or silent environments, or what seems to be like unspoiled nature, are more and more sought after by trail sport participants, but also by the wider public. And headlines about the nature deficit of our species, doctors prescribing nature to their patients, the impact of being in green areas or blue spaces on our physical and mental well-being are all making the news quite regularly, at least in Western Europe, right? And this poses questions on how, as a society, we merely use nature as a backdrop, which, as you saw on the sign earlier, these nature conservation organizations are also claiming. So, and this also raises questions about who has access to our nature, right? Because the skill set that ultra trail runners and walkers develop gives them more access to experience certain types of nature or environments in a way that the wider public or people who tend to stay on predefined routes or trails, don't really have. So paradoxically, trail runners and walkers constitute a threat to the very natural environments that they crave so much. But on the other hand, as we saw, the altered landscape due to extreme weather events or biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, is not immediately perceived as a threat to their sport, because in the moment, as we saw in the vignette, it becomes a part of the hardship and the difficulty that they've endured on the trails, and it thus contributes to the kind of endurance that is celebrated, and is also who can endure and who gets to be celebrated, right, for that endurance. So as people long for more nature connection or want to move through these, wilder places, they want to preserve these natural environments, but then this often translates into removing ourselves from the areas that we wish to preserve. And so, instead of making trails and paths to reach these so-called unspoiled environments, organizations and government institutions are trying to lead people away from these places to ensure their existence. This is, for example, done through rewilding projects as well. Although nowadays, in these rewilding projects, humans are considered to be part of the ecosystem, and as participants in the ecological recovery of these areas, as long as the human activity is not overriding the ecosystem's ability to regenerate, right? So so they're not considered separate anymore from these ecosystems. But so people might be temporarily banned, or zones like this might be created. So basically, it's just managed how people can access this land, or in these projects at least. So trail sport participants who then want to challenge themselves by exploring these places are making them less, wild. They're putting ecological pressures on these environments. So, but as we've seen, the sensory and affective disturbances that these runners and walkers are now encountering more frequently also on the trails unsettle the familiar framing of trail sports as personal conquest or as the pure aesthetic consumption of nature. So instead of a neutral backdrop to endurance challenges, the landscape is asserting itself even more as an active agent marked by climate-induced fragilities. So the trails move from being the stage for proving one's limit to a site where environmental precarity is felt physically and effectively. So when we go back to this, how liberated, are trail runners and walkers and other trail sport participants, for that matter, from the trappings of the modern world, when the very environments, the environments, the trails, the landscapes through and with which they move are themselves increasingly unstable. Trail sports are often celebrated as opportunities to escape society and to measure personal limits against an enduring nature. Yet the current anthropogenic climate crisis unsettles this imagined reciprocity. On the trails, climate change is not just an abstract data set or a distant projection. It is encountered as washed out paths, uprooted forests, erratic seasons, and the subtle but accumulative sensory disruptions that shape each step. The texture of mud and clay that should not be there, the loss of shade created by trees that are burned, and the creating of new trails where they should not be created. So rather than being liberated from modernity, as Itra suggests, but also a lot of escapism theories in literature, trail sport participants find contemporary realities inscribed in the landscape itself, revealing how even the most remote experience of bodily immersion is now mediated by a rapidly shifting climate. So the embodied and emplaced encounters of trail sport participants do cultivate a relational ethic in which moving through and with landscapes entails responsibility, reciprocity, and a recognition of vulnerability rather than the pursuit of an individual achievement alone. So to conclude, I'd like to circle back to this anthropology on trails, where trails emerge as spaces where the anthropogenic climate crisis is proximate, visible, and where its tangible consequences are sensed rather than being abstract and distant. So through people's leisure activities, these trails become the subject of narratives and practices that have the potential to contribute to rather than detract from long-term sustainability of these environments. And it is through this dialectical relationship that trail sports participants have, and how they consequently perceive climate-induced changes in their own terms, that these sporting activities offer ways to ground climate change discourses in everyday practices and interactions, keeping in mind, though, who exactly is participating in these activities. So trail sports thus function as sites where knowledge about human-environment relations is actively generated, and an anthropology on trails can teach us about the mutual relations of humans and more than humans, and their competing knowledges, struggles, interests, powers. Studying the way trail sport participants inhabit these environments can teach us how human-environment relations are fraught with politics and competing claims, with different types of knowledges, and with long histories, injustices, and even violences. At the same time, though, they are also sites of creativity, resilience, and dare I say, hope. Thank you for listening.